You're listening to The Big Picture with Edwin Eisendrath on WCPT 820.
All right, everybody. Don Moynihan is back. He is, of course, an award-winning professor of public policy at the University of Michigan's Ford School of Public Policy. His research focuses on how to improve government functioning. And, past administrations have used his research to improve government service delivery. And by the way, so, have the World Bank, the UN, the OECD, and others. And, for several years, Don has been exploring the question, can we still govern, in his fabulous Substack publication of the same name. Don, welcome back.
I'm so happy to join you. Thank you for having me back, Edwin.
Hey, big organizations, really big organizations like government departments and agencies, they are enormously complicated and they can be frustrating. And your work has helped them better meet their mandates, right, and serve their customers. I guess I got to ask you, how does it feel watching the dismantling of those agencies and the efforts to make them not work?
It is depressing. I'm not going to lie to you. And I think, my feelings are probably felt a lot more intensely by the actual public employees working in government. Like you said, government is big. And when we talk about government, we're really talking about a lot of different organizations pursuing quite different goals and quite different tasks, and they need different expertise. And so one size fits all mentality doesn't really work. So you sort of incrementally try to chip away at the edges, make services work better. And the promise of DOGE and the promise of President Trump is that you don't need to do that. You just need to go in with a chainsaw and cut, and somehow that will make everything better. But that's not really how it works. You have to do some analysis of what it is that the program or agency is trying to do, whether those tasks have value, what will happen if you remove them, what will happen if you do them somewhat differently. That's hard work. And that's what a lot of federal employees are doing in their daily jobs. And instead, we're really now experiencing a moment of administrative vandalism where the theory is you don't need to know anything. You just cut.
Administrative vandalism is a very good phrase. I'm going to remember that. If you had to rank the damaging things that the Trump administration has been doing to, the government's ability to do its job, what would be in the top of the list? Unrelenting and unthoughtful cutting is surely one of them. I guess that's, in my view, the destruction of the workforce. But there are a few other things they're doing, too.
Yeah, so I think in the short term, we're just trying to make sense of what is going on. And you're seeing, I think, an element of risk being introduced into the way in which government operates. And, the term risk is not my term. The Government Accountability Office, which is a nonpartisan congressional body that analyzes what government does in a much more careful way than what DOGE is doing, has this high-risk series where they identify where are parts of government that could break down or are not doing their job well enough. And so that idea that government performs a lot of stuff that most of the time we don't notice because it works is something that most, we don't think about every day. Like, we don't really think about who are the employees who take care of nuclear weapons in America, right? And DOGE fired a bunch of those employees. It fired about 1 in 5 of those employees. And then it figured out, people from Congress are calling us up and they're mad about this. Maybe we shouldn't have fired them. And so they tried to rehire as many as they could find, but they had already cut off their email access. And now we're hearing stories that they fired some of them a second time. And there's a level of carelessness there where it increases the risk that something dramatic could go just badly wrong, right? And so that is, I think, one type of risk we should think about is catastrophic failure because they simply weren't enough people doing the job, or the people with the right skills were not in place. And we might think about other areas like that, FAA, which keeps the planes in the sky. Trump has targeted FEMA for cuts. We need a national disaster agency. Then I think there's another area of risk, which is just long-term erosion, where the things that have actually made America great are just going to be slowly ground away. And here I'm thinking about things like scientific research, where the Trump administration has made clear that they're going to really try to cut spending on scientific research, medical research, the types of research that generate breakthroughs that we all rely on. And that will blow a hole in a lot of economies outside of D.C., especially those that sort of focus on research. Think about a lot of university towns and places like Ann Arbor, where I live, but also across much of the South and Midwest of the country as well, not just coastal universities. In the long run, that sort of research was part of what made America great in the post-World War II era. Government and universities said, we're going to build a scientific enterprise together. Government is going to fund a lot of it. Universities will fund a lot of it, but it'll be a joint enterprise. And now government is basically pulling away from that, or the Trump administration is, even though it's been a fantastically successful system for generating research knowledge. So I think that's, you're not going to see that risk mean some sort of collapse in, planes falling out of the sky tomorrow, but it does mean the erosion of some of the qualities that made America a draw around the world, a leader in higher education, a leader in the scientific enterprise. And as that goes, you see, I think, an erosion of America's standing in the world as well. So I think that's the second type of risk that is going to be harder to quantify. The third type of risk is just getting people to come back and work in the public sector. The traditional deal here was you're going into government usually for a couple of reasons, usually for a combination of a couple of reasons. One is that you're interested in public service. You like the idea of helping people. You think government is a way you could do that. The other is you think, well, maybe I get paid less than I would in the private sector, but it's a more stable work environment. Those two qualities are really being tested right now. You have a government that's telling its employees, we don't think what you're doing has any value, and we can fire you with half an hour's notice. And that, I think, is really going to damage this type of public service bargain that's existed in the U.S. for a long period of time. And so when I teach my students who are going to go into government or hope to go into government in the future, I think they're just going to be a lot more skeptical that the type of deal that previous generations of public servants had of stable work, of pursuing non-political work is still going to be on the table for them. And so many of them, I think, will just say, well, why would I go into government when I have lots of options elsewhere?
Wow. So I want to take all three of those just for a second. And there are a few more things I want to talk about. But on catastrophic failure, I just want to be sure I understand, because the examples that you gave are FAA, FEMA, and nuclear safety. I mean, the first Trump administration had a catastrophic failure in its handling of a virus, right, of COVID. And that's before they had dismantled the government's mechanisms for dealing with. They just ignored the ones they had, but they were at least still there and pushing back. I just want to understand, when you say catastrophic, you are talking about big catastrophes, a nuclear meltdown, a plane falling out of the sky, an earthquake or a flood or a hurricane that no one responds to.
Yeah, I'm talking about the stuff that's going to be like front page news for days or weeks, things where the public says, isn't the government supposed to be taking care of all of this? Like, aren't there supposed to be some adults in charge? Another example is CDC laid off a bunch of people, including those whose job it is to track viruses. USDA laid off people who were tracking the bird flu virus and its outbreak. And, potentially we're on the eve of another outbreak. Yeah. And it feels like the lesson from the last pandemic was we paid too much attention to tracking the virus. We should have just ignored it and let it run rampant. And, I think that sort of attitude is going to just have huge damaging consequences. And we can't predict, what will go wrong when. We don't know if the bird flu virus will mutate to the point that it's a real threat to human beings. But something will break at some point, and I think we're going to look at this moment and say, what were they thinking?
Mm-hmm. Okay, so that's the catastrophic failure. I understood the long-term erosion, and you talked about it within government and within the towns that support that research, university and research places all over the country. But it's also the economic future of the country, I assume, as well. We invented things. And the biggest companies in America are all tech companies invented here. I assume they'll be invented in other parts of the world if we're not doing the research going forward.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at university towns, there's usually a very healthy economy around those regions because there's a bunch of spin-offs that come from the innovations on campus. And, Silicon Valley is just the most successful example of that. Or if you look in Cambridge, you look at a lot of startup companies that happen there. It's not a coincidence that they happened around universities, which becomes sort of spur of innovation and an economic activity. And the rest of the world has been spending decades looking at America's edge in attracting talent and fueling this innovation. And they've been trying, mostly unsuccessfully, to recreate that. And it feels like now we're just sort of giving away our lead when it comes to economic innovation in the world. That, the people who benefited so much, including people in Silicon Valley, from that innovation, are now confident that America no longer needs the source of that innovation, that they can take it on themselves. And I think that's incredibly short-sighted because a lot of that innovation came from basic research where it wasn't clear what the economic, if you're a venture capitalist, you are not saying let's do basic research if it's not going to pay off for us. But that's sort of basic research.
They had Xerox PARC, they had Bell Labs, and they begged the government to take some of those costs away and change that bargain because it wasn't efficient for them.
Exactly. And, I think it's just a misreading of American history to ignore how those factors really mattered to the success of America in the late 20th century.
I want to ask a question about this federal workforce. My understanding is that it's about 20% veterans because there's I know the idea of having hiring preferences is under the gun at the moment, but the federal government has a hiring preference. If two candidates are roughly the same or, indistinguishable in their applications, if one served in the armed services, they get a preference. And so I think about 20% of the federal workforce is veterans, and they're being laid off now. Does that sound right to you?
Yeah, it's actually even higher. It's about 3 in 10 civilian workers. Yeah, and so just to be clear, I'm not talking about people in uniform. Right. 3 in 10 civilian workers are veterans. So other parts of government, and when you start to think about it, it makes sense. That's a very large number. As you mentioned, the veterans' preference. So historically, for decades and decades, we've always, effectively had a form of affirmative action for veterans to recognize their service. But veterans also have strong reasons to be more attracted to government. About 70% of our civilian employees work in Homeland Security, Department of Defense, or Veterans Affairs. Mm-hmm. And so those are all areas that have sort of a national security dimension where if you've worked in the military, you might think this is a logical place for me to continue to stay. Wow. There's also incentives for them to stay in government and get a better pension as a result. But, the sort of the old joke about the U.S. government is that it's an insurance company with an army. So, we spend a lot of money on military national security, and then we spend a lot of money on social benefits, but you don't actually employ that many people to provide the social benefits like SNAP or Medicaid. Those are not big parts of the government in terms of employment, but national security absolutely is. And so any cuts to government, any cuts to probationary employees will disproportionately hit the veteran community. About 5% of the private sector workforce are veterans and about 30% of the public sector workforce. So if you just cut across the board, you are going to hit more veterans.
I want to say that's just from a political perspective, that is incredibly stupid politics. But for that, I am grateful. You've written about the enormously clear evidence that filling governments with patronage hires decreases the effectiveness of those governments on a wide range of measures. And growing up in Chicago when Richard J. Daley was mayor, boy, do I know that. The patronage world is a world where things don't get done, or they get done unevenly and not very well and very expensively. And you've talked about that in all kinds of systems. But it looks to me with Schedule F, whatever they're calling it these days, that's exactly what this administration wants to do to the federal government. Fill it after they finish laying everybody off. They'll probably hire back, and they'll hire back people with no qualifications other than that they're on the guy's team.
Yeah, well, one of the things that President Trump has said is that there will be a hiring policy once they're done with cuts. But two things to know about that. One is that the hiring policy is going to be designed by James Shirk, who designed the Schedule F policy to reclassify civil servants into political appointee status. And so, if the past is prologue here, you can expect that hiring policy to be much more vulnerable to political interference. The second thing Trump has said is that when they hire back, they'll only hire back one person for every 4 people who've been let go. But the people who will approve those hires will be members of Musk's Doge team. And so, that makes it an inherently political process. And so I do worry, we're having this sort of indiscriminate phase of firing right now. I think there's going to be more targeted phases where they're going to look for people they suspect are Democrats and fire them. And then when it comes to hiring, they're going to look for people that they suspect are Republicans and favor them. And when I say indiscriminate phase of firing, one thing I should clarify is that there is more layoffs occurring in agencies that are characterized as liberal than agencies that are characterized as conservative. And let me explain. Let me explain what I mean by that. Political scientists try to classify federal agencies by liberal or conservative dimensions. So, for example, we might think about the Department of Defense as a more conservative agency, CFPB, the Consumer Financial Protection Board, as a more liberal agency. And it's very clear that there are simply more layoffs occurring in those liberal types of agencies.
And these tend to be smaller. You would think if they're really just trying to be efficient, they would look at the biggest agencies first, but that's not what they're doing, is it?
No, they are not. As I said before, VA, DOD, and Homeland Security are, that's 7 out of 10 civilian employees are working in those agencies. And those agencies have been much more immune from cuts than smaller and more liberal agencies.
Yeah. I think, let me go back to your Musk is in these financial systems as well. And I have this nightmare fantasy that the government will break, that people won't get their Social Security checks, or hospitals won't get the Medicare money that's coming to them, that fundamentally things will break. And they'll break at this, and people need these things. It's not like we can say, well, that's fine, they're broken, we don't need them. So that when they're broken, Mr. Musk can provide an alternative. Say, well, but I've redone X, and we'll do all this through there. Don't worry, you'll be taken care of. We'll do it this way. And we will have seen the taking of our government private.
Yeah, so we're in this sort of era now where we're not quite sure of what Musk's intentions are. So some stuff is clear. He clearly wants a smaller government. He clearly wants many fewer regulations. And he is hoovering up federal data in a way we've never seen before. There has been no entity in history that's comparable to DOGE in terms of its access to our personal data across government. What is he going to do with all of that information? We still don't know. I don't know if the plan is to start building AI models using this government data and start testing them out on the public, rather than starting small and testing them in the private sector first. I don't know if the plan is to try and capture more government services, but at the moment, if you're regulating Musk's businesses, he can fire you. Or if you're regulating his contracts, he can fire you. And if you're potentially pursuing lawsuits against Musk, he can fire you. And some of those lawsuits are being dropped as we speak. And so from a business point of view, Musk has put himself in a position where he is protecting his existing businesses, and they're increasing in value even though they're less profitable than before. And he is also looking for opportunities to use government data and use his access to government to carve out new business opportunities. But we just don't really know what that looks like at this point.
Yeah, it's terrifying. Terrifying. All right, let me go to a different topic, also something you've written about. America is never, well, that's not true. We haven't had a cult of personality around a president. A real one, maybe since George Washington. And George Washington famously walked away. Again, you've written about the dangers of a personalist, as you call it, presidency. Talk to people about that.
Sure. And one of the things that's happened in political science over the last decade is that those of us who study American government have had to look to people who study government in other countries to make sense of what's going on in America, because it's so unprecedented. And there are, a variety of concepts that have been helpful, including populism. But personalism is one of those concepts. And personalism is something we associate with weaker democracies, unstable governments, weak political parties. And so it on its face doesn't really fit with America. But when you start to describe what it is, it does very much describe the Trump administration now and the Republican Party over the last decade. Personalism means effectively you build a political movement around loyalty to the leader rather than a shared ideology. And then once in power, you build a legal infrastructure that protects the leader, ensure he benefits from power, puts family members and cronies in place, uses the legal system to target his enemies, to profit in private ways. And so it's sort of check, check, check. All of those things are happening now. We have Trump as a candidate who, really pushed anyone who questioned him out of the party. I think only 2 people who voted to impeach him remain in the Republican Party right now as elected officials. And you see him in a second term in a way he just didn't manage in the first term, turning government into this personalist infrastructure where, his private lawyers are now running the Department of Justice and cutting all of these shady deals in order to protect Trump, release his political supporters from prison, punish people for doing their jobs, in some cases, such as the January 6th prosecutors. And it really creates a sense of the state is built around the interests of this one individual rather than the interests of the public.
Yeah. I worry because the news comes so fast that we talk about the news, and that has a bizarre normalizing effect. I've been a reader of your Substack newsletter for a long time, Can We Still Govern? And the arc of your writing is heartbreaking. And it sort of breaks, to see it over time, breaks out of this one thing that Trump's doing or another. You began writing, about the interesting things we can do to make government better and more efficient, and asking questions about, what's getting in the way of that. And now you're looking at government as a case study in what not to do. I mean, do you feel that that over time transformation? It's really fascinating and heartbreaking.
Yeah, I absolutely would prefer to be writing about innovations in government, tools to make government work better. And, every so often I still do. I find something that feels joyful and positive to me, that gives me hope for the future. But I also want to be realistic. And when the house is burning, you got to point out what's going on and not sugarcoat it. And so increasingly, a lot of my work is just trying to make sense of the news and give a broader perspective to it in a way that, as you say, if you just read the headlines or if you just read the stories, it's always about some disagreement or some conflict. And it doesn't always give you the context that you need to really understand from a bigger picture, from a historical perspective, what we're living through.
Yeah, I don't know that people understand that scholars become the scholars in the fields they do because they love them. And it is an enormous amount of time and an enormous amount of work and dedication. And, you picked a topic, how does government do its job better? Because it's something that matters to you. And so a lot of the time you're spending now isn't quite in the same realm of scholarship. Like, I note that you took the time to help John Oliver's staff learn how to talk about what's going on in government for whatever this show is called, Last Week Tomorrow, or whatever the name of that show is.
Last Week Tonight,
Last Week Tonight, because it's so popular and such an important way to get the word out to people. And you're spending time on radio shows like this. This isn't doing scholarship, but it is living the mission that sent you into scholarship.
Yeah, it's been a transformation and not an entirely welcome one. I prefer to be spending my time elsewhere. And I think it just reflects what's going on with the world, where it was great when I could write my articles and my books that sort of explained how do we make government work better. And that assumed that we had a basic consensus that we all agreed government should work better. and that we agree that having a non-political public service was a way to get there. And now that consensus has broken. And so much more of my time now is just spent being sort of a public explainer to remind people, well, why do we need a nonpartisan civil service? Why is that better than having a highly politicized system? And, for a few years, it's been warning, like, here's what we know from history and from research and evidence about this. And now it's more witnessing, here's what's unfolding before our eyes.
Yeah. Well, as I said to you before, I'm very grateful that you're doing it. It's enormously helpful. And I am, I'm not foolish about what this challenge is in front of us, but I do believe that what they are doing is profoundly unpopular, and work like yours is helping Americans understand why they have to be stopped. So, Don, thank you very, very much for your continued efforts and your willingness to share them with our audience here.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to talk to you.